everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I am going to take our first look at Lost Caverns of Ixalan. This is a preview episode, meaning that I have not played with any of the cards in this set. I guess technically there are a couple of reprints, but I have not played with the set. I have studied the commons and uncommons pretty extensively, going over them in primarily color pairs and thinking about what each of the color pairs are trying to do and which of the cards support those themes and how well supported those themes are and whether they look powerful or not and all of that. And today I'm going to share that with you. But all of this is just based on my own assessments, so giant grain of salt for the fact that I haven't played with any of this yet, but I've done my homework, so hopefully it's not too far off. So the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for appropriate patrons. These notes go into detail on the key uncommons and key commons for each of the archetypes, listing cards that stood out to me as supporting that archetype. It's not necessarily, in all cases, the strongest cards that could be in that archetype. It's like a combination of power level is essential to figuring out what's important to an archetype because a card needs to be strong in order to pull you into an archetype, but I'm primarily looking at which cards support the themes or would lead you want to draft that color pair in an archetype. So that's kind of what's going on with the cards that I've listed in these notes for people who have the notes to follow along with. And then I'll be talking through some of it, but since it's just like a very long list of indecipherable to people who have not played it card names and then reading full text, it's not great to have to read a ton of full text. I'm going to try to summarize with a few examples or something. We'll see what feels right when I get to it. So that's what we're going to do. So this is going to be archetype by archetype and then some kind of overall thoughts at the end. So starting with blue-white. Blue-white's stated theme is artifacts, specifically artifact control. This is as opposed to blue-red, which is designed as artifact aggro. And then red-white is tap mid-range, according to the Wizard's archetype description thing. In reality, I think all three of these, all of the Jeskai colors lean pretty heavily into artifacts. Talk some about how the three color groups, some of them make sense and some of them don't. Most of them don't, a few of them make a lot of sense. Jeskai is very centered on artifacts, and then you have your blue-red, aggro, blue-white, control, and then red-white in the middle, theoretically. I think that red-white is on the more aggressive side. I suspect that blue-red and red-white are both can shift a little bit toward more controlling, but kind of by default want to be more aggressive. Blue-white, I think, is pretty firmly more controlling. So most of the key cards that you're looking for in blue-white are basically just cheap artifacts that hang out and play. A lot of them have craft or are good with crafting, where they do something that gives you some kind of value right away, and then you have this thing that's hanging out. And you have a lot of cards that that there's a thing hanging out, and then you get all these things that are hanging out that let you spend mana to turn them into a high-impact thing in the late game. So you're kind of just littering the board with permanents that don't really do anything, and then trying to make the game go long enough that you can invest mana in all of them to make them do something. So for example, Clay-Fired Bricks is a pretty important white uncommon to, I think, all of the white archetypes except for white-green. And the reason for that is that Clay-Fired Bricks is 1 and a white for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for planes, put it in your hand, and gain 2 life. And then for 7 mana, 5 white, you can craft it with an artifact. So you have to exile an artifact from player from your graveyard to transform it into a card that gives all of your creatures +1/+1 and makes 2 1/1 artifact gnome creatures. So up front, you're just getting a land and 2 life for 2 mana, and then you have this extra artifact in play. The reason that you want this is there are a lot of cards that let you tap artifacts for some kind of value, or that get benefits when you control artifacts, or In white-black, there are a lot of cards that let you sacrifice artifacts for some kind of effect. So you can use this artifact after it's found to plains to do something else. You can craft it into something else. You can sacrifice it to get an effect, maybe get something from the fact that it's gone to the graveyard through descend triggers. And then if you don't do that and you end up having it in play, once you have 7 mana, there will likely be an artifact in your graveyard, and then you can convert it into like a Glorious Anthem and 2 1/1s that are then 2/2s. So you're putting 4/4 worth of power and toughness into play immediately, in addition to pumping the rest of your team, and then it continues pumping the rest of your team. That's kind of, there are a bunch of cards that are kind of in that space. For example, Spring-Loaded Saw Blades is another kind of premium white uncommon for defensive decks. That's 1 and a white artifact with flash. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to a tapped creature. And then for 3 and a white, you can craft it with another artifact, and it becomes a 5/5 vehicle that you can crew by tapping 2 other artifacts or creatures, or it just has crew 1. So that's another thing where you got a removal spell up front, and then it left an artifact just hanging out on the battlefield, being an artifact, letting you tap it for stuff you'd want to tap artifacts for. And then it also gives you this like mana sink where you can turn it into a body, and the body is pretty good if you have other artifacts around that can crew it without even needing to tap a creature potentially. So white-green is like pump aggro, and green doesn't really care about artifacts. But the other white archetypes, you have blue-white is artifact control. Red-white likes to have a bunch of objects because it's kind of about tapping things for extra value. And then white-black, you can sacrifice these things to your sacrifice effects, and you have a bunch of those. White-black's sacrifice theme. So all of these like random trinket uncommons matter for that stuff. And then among commons, Adaptive Gem Guard. This is 3 and a white for a 3/3, and then at sorcery speed, you can tap 2 untapped artifacts and or creatures you control to put a +1/+1 counter on this. That's kind of like doing the red-white stated thing, but it makes a lot of sense in blue-white to have this creature that you can just make bigger with your objects that are lying around. You're planning to play a long game, so it can hang out and block for you while you're growing it. Then there's Inverted Iceberg. This is 1 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 1 and draw a card. And then for 6 mana, you can craft it into a 6/6 that like untaps an artifact when it attacks or something. So this is a Prophetic Prism type card. It doesn't fix your mana, but it cycles into play. And then it's just in play, so you can tap it for your gem guards or your other stuff. It milled you. Maybe you hit something that you can craft with off of that mill. And then, like all the other things, in the late game, you can spend some mana and turn it into a threat. There's also Oaken Siren, which is 1 and a blue for a 1/2 flying vigilance, and it taps for a blue mana that you can only use to cast artifacts. So this thing's pretty good at getting in for 1 damage, and then it's also a mana creature, and it can do both at the same time. I think as long as your deck is mostly artifacts, this card's very good. And then another really key white common, again, I think that this card's super important for all of the white archetypes except green-white, is Tinker's Tote. This is 2 and a white artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you make 2 1/1 gnomes, and then you can spend a white and sacrifice Tinker's Tote to gain 3 life. I think that you're not going to want to do that very often. Maybe if you're planning to craft with it, you can sacrifice it the turn before you would craft with it, to craft with it from the graveyard. But this is 3 objects for 3 mana, and all of the white archetypes, except green-white, are very interested in just counting your objects. You can generally use artifacts and creatures interchangeably, so the fact that only 2 of your objects are gnomes, while one of them is just like an artifact that's not actively doing anything, those aren't really that different, I think. So this is just a lot of objects in a lot of archetypes that care about the objects. So yeah, I think there's like pretty good support in terms of just like cards that either like draw a card or get you a card in some way immediately, or get you a card's worth of value in the case of like the Saw Blades, or give you multiple objects, one of which is an artifact. So I think that there's pretty good support for this like go wide, have a bunch of artifacts plan. You're trying to play a control game, so you want to prioritize removal in addition to this like just cards that make objects. But I think that blue-white's theme overall makes a good amount of sense. The blue-white signpost card, incidentally, Master's Guide Mural is a 5-mana artifact that makes a 4/4 golem when it enters, and then the artifact itself doesn't do anything except that it has a craft ability after it makes that golem. And for 7 mana, you can flip it over into a thing that like you can tap to make a golem if an artifact entered the battlefield this turn, including when you craft it, it exiles and comes back, so it enters, and so it can make a golem right away. Very good like source of inevitability, but I do think 5 mana for a 4/4 is pretty below rate, and then you need 7 mana to make another golem. It's gonna like win long games eventually, but I think as far as like gold signpost cards go, I'm relatively low on it. I think that like you want to have a bunch of these like other things that you can spend mana to turn them into like threats late. And I feel like in a lot of ways, Master's Guide is just like more of what your deck already does anyway. So I'm not super high on that. Like I don't think that I want to take it as a reason to go into blue-white. I'm much more interested in taking some of these kind of just the value artifacts that support any of a variety of different archetypes, and then figuring out which lane they put me into as far as my early picks that are going to get me into this archetype. Up next, white-black. White-black's stated theme is sacrifice. Some notable uncommons. The white-black signpost gold uncommon is Bartolome del Presidio, whatever. It's a 2/1. You can sacrifice an artifact or creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can do that at instant speed, and it doesn't cost anything to do it. So it's a free sack outlet that's always available. In general, I think free sack outlets play better than they read. There are, just a lot of spots where things naturally are going to die, and if it doesn't cost you anything to be able to sack them to get value out of it, you end up doing that a lot. So I expect this will be pretty good. Abyssal Gorestalker is a 4 BB, so 6 mana, 6/6. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices 2 creatures. If you have like random creatures that don't matter, like there are 1/1 fungus tokens that can't block, for example, that you can sacrifice, and your opponent's losing 2 real creatures, it's going to be very good for you. Chupacabra Echo. This is a 3/2 uncommon for 2 BB. When it enters the battlefield, target creature gets -X/-X, where X is the number of permanents in your graveyard. It's a very strong effect if you could like get some stuff in your graveyard, and then if you're playing like a sacrifice theme, you're probably going to be sacrificing permanents, and they'll end up in your graveyard, and so it'll work. And then, as I mentioned, you're still going to be looking for the white artifact enabler stuff that just gives you objects that you can sacrifice. And then I think that this deck really wants to prioritize like 1-mana creatures. There are a lot of cheap creatures that work reasonably as far as things that you can sacrifice, but also work well as things that you can buff. So jumping ahead a little to a key common, there's a common called Glorifier of Suffering, which is 2 and a white for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can sack a creature or artifact, and when you do, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 creatures. It can target itself, which is very important. In the past, there have been some creatures that do this, but they don't target themselves, so you need to have 2 other creatures to get 2 counters out of it. With this one, you only need 1 other creature in addition to a thing that you're sacrificing to get 2 counters. It also only costs 3 mana, where this effect often costs 4 mana. So if you can play a creature or a thing that you can sacrifice on turn 1, and then a creature and or thing you can sacrifice on turn 2, then on turn 3 you play this, you sacrifice one of the things, you pump itself, and you pump another thing. The reason that I think that's good is that it just gets you a lot of power in play, which is particularly good because there are a number of like 1 and 2 mana 1/1 creatures that have flying and an additional ability like lifelink or vigilance. So there's like Rune Lurker Bat at uncommon is a 1 mana 1/1 flying lifelink at the beginning of your end step. If you descended this turn, you get to scry 1. And so like playing that, and then something that you want to sacrifice, and then Glorifier of Suffering to put a counter on that and a counter on the Glorifier means that you'll get to attack with a 2/2 flying lifelink and have a 4/3 and get to scry at your end step in addition to whatever the thing that you sacrificed did. So I think that Black-White is looking to be pretty aggressive because it's looking to have a low curve, because it wants to play a bunch of cheap things that are like good to sacrifice or good to pump with this Glorifier of Suffering type card. And I think that the deck ends up playing like a very nickel and dimey aggro game, very similar to other Orzhov decks, where you're just like making your opponent like lose one life a bunch in different ways, either through evasive attackers, or there's like a common 3 mana 1/4. You can tap, sacrifice a creature or artifact to drain your opponent for 1. This kind of card reads is pretty unimpressive, but I know Grima slightly overperformed in Lord of the Rings as far as like a way to kind of like close out a game that was a little bit stalled, and this effect is pretty similar to that. That's kind of like the general play pattern that I'm expecting here is you're going to go wide with cheap stuff. You're going to have a decent amount of evasion. You're going to have some ways to pump your creatures. You're going to have some ways to make your opponent lose life outside of combat. And you're going to attack early, get them low by the time they stabilize, and then try to like finish them off before they can turn the corner. There are some other like, Market Gnome, for example, the 0/3 that draws a card and gains life when it dies would be a good thing to put in that curve where you're trying to sacrifice it. At common, there's a 1/1 flying vigilance that when it dies, target creature explores for a single white. And then there's also, another card that I'm pretty excited about is Mephitic Draft. This is 1 and a black artifact. When it enters the battlefield or when it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you lose life and draw a card. So I think Mephitic Draft is kind of like the most important common for white-black. And I don't think most of the other decks are that excited about it because most of the other decks are going to have trouble getting it to go to the graveyard, or it won't be as easy as it is for white-black. And because most of the I want an artifact to be in play as an object stuff is in Jeskai, there's less competition to get it just as a cantrip like artifact. There's still, I think blue-black is pretty interested in having it and finding any black cards that they can that let them sacrifice it, because it's a good way to trigger Descend. Potentially same thing with green-black, but it's easiest to use in white-black, so there's a chance that you'll get more of them than you would if other people could use it as well as you could when you're in white-black. And then, 2 mana, draw 2, and enable a sacrifice is very, very good. So I think that's a key grindy card in this like archetype that's otherwise pretty aggressive. You also have like Skullcap Snail. That's a 2 mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, your opponent exiles a card from their hand. That's another good thing that you can just like you got some value out of, and you can be pretty happy to sacrifice. So overall, I think the theme seems pretty well supported. There are a number of sack outlets and a lot of like ways to get reasonable things to sacrifice. And yeah, I think that archetype is going to be pretty fun. I will probably draft it in a way that like leans a little bit more value over a little bit more aggro, where I think the best performing aggregate versions will be a little bit more aggressive than the ones that I draft. I mentioned, really leaning into Glorifier of Suffering. I think that's what's going to work better for most people, and I probably won't do quite enough, knowing me. Moving on to White-Red. White-Red's stated theme, as I mentioned, is tapping midrange. So there are a number of cards that let you tap 2 artifacts or creatures for some kind of effect. And then there are also some things that do something when they become tapped. It looks like this is another attempt to get kind of like a Lorehold style approach to red-white, where you can play more of a mid-range game. You like getting artifacts in play. You can do craft stuff to get more power later. I don't know how well that actually worked. It still looks to me like while you might be able to draft this a little bit more with like more of an eye toward the late game, I still think you mostly want to try to be aggressive. Most or all of the stuff that lets you tap things for some kind of effect. Either it can only be used at sorcery speed, or it can only be used like when you attack. So you can't just like hang out with all your stuff untapped on your opponent's turn and then get a bunch of value by tapping your things in their end step. That means that like this mechanic in general doesn't pair super well with blocking. So it's easier if you're the proactive deck in the matchup. So I think that red white's going to end up being pretty aggressive, but it's interesting to have a set that supports it being something other than just like Boros go wide aggro or whatever. So the signpost uncommon for this is Caparocti Sunborn. This is 4 mana 4/4. When it attacks, you can tap 2 artifacts or creatures to discover 3. 4/4 for 4 is pretty good. Abrade is one of the premium removal spells at common, which obviously doesn't kill this. It's decently likely to untap after you play it, and then when you attack, getting to discover in combat while attacking with a 4/4 is very good. It's not hard to have 2 things to tap. There is also a common 3 mana creature that can tap to give something haste. So if you have a very good draw, you can potentially play this, tap something, you give it haste, and tap other things to discover with it the turn you play it. Not easy to do that on turn 4 because your entire turn 3 is going to give it haste, and so you need to have 2 other objects that you played on turns 1 and 2 to activate it, but it is possible. Careening Minecart is a 3 mana 3/3 vehicle with crew 1 that makes a treasure when it attacks. Anything that makes a treasure is particularly valuable in red white because these treasures can just kind of like hang out and tap for your effect for your stuff. So I think that one's pretty interesting. And then, as with all the others, you're into the like clay-fired brick style cards, the like white artifacts that give you some kind of value when you play them and then just kind of hang out. Diamond Pickaxe is a red indestructible equipment for single red to cast, 2 to equip. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, and when it attacks, you make a treasure. It's another way to make a treasure, just to get a bunch of artifacts into play. And then Dowsing Device is a pretty weird card. It's 1 in a red for an artifact. When this or another artifact enters the battlefield, target creature gets +1/+0 and haste. So obviously with any artifact creature, this gives, like, the creature can give itself haste. So this is a 2 mana card that gives all your artifact creatures haste and also gives them extra power the turn they enter. And then if you have 4 artifacts, when this triggers, you transform it into a land that taps for red, and then you can tap 2 in a red and tap it to give target creature +X/+0, where X is the number of artifacts you control at sorcery speed. Very good if you have like a flyer or a trampler or something. This kind of card that like takes a whole card and only pumps like a creature temporarily is difficult to evaluate and often bad, but I'm pretty optimistic about this one. And then, there are a bunch of other random uncommons that are decent in this archetype. And then commons, you have the Gem Guard, the 3 mana 3/3 that you can tap 2 things to put a +1/+1 counter on it at sorcery speed. So we've seen a lot of 4 mana 3/3s that have ways to grow periodically. The blue 4 mana 3/3 in Lord of the Rings that grows when you draw your second card comes to mind as a premium example. That one was pretty easy to grow every turn and pretty bad. In general, I'm not very optimistic about 4 mana 3/3 that grows over time, but I do think that pretty realistic to be able to get to the point where this is growing multiple times a turn, and it's pretty easy to have it grow the turn you play it. It's possible that this will just be bad, but it seems to me like it has much higher upside than a lot of similar cards. More on that topic when I get to red-black. There's a common 2 mana 2/2 artifact in both red and white. The white one, when it becomes tapped, scries 1. The red one, when it becomes tapped, rummages. Those are kind of your, like, I don't know, workman-like nuts and bolts kind of enabler for what's going on in this deck. Obviously, the Tinkerer's Tote is a really good way to get a bunch of objects to use the Gem Guard. So, I think that like overall red-white looks pretty aggressive to me, but maybe better at playing late games than red-white decks would normally be. Up next, white-green. So white-green's stated theme is buffs aggro. This is not very deeply supported in terms of payoffs for having creatures that are bigger. So the signpost uncommon in green-white is Kutzel Melmet Explorer. This is 1 green-white for a 3/3. Your opponents can't cast spells on your turn. And when one or more creatures with power greater than their base power deal combat damage to an opponent, draw a card. This is really the thing that asks you to have creatures that are bigger. I think I saw a tweet that there might have been more of these at some point in the set's development, but they were removed because they read pretty awkward. There's another one of them at a higher rarity, but there are only those two. And then there are a lot of cards that support that theme. There are a lot of cards that put +1/+1 counters on things. There are cards that explore, and obviously when you explore, you might get a +1/+1 counter. There is an artifact that interacts with +1/+1 counters. I think it's pretty good. Explorer's Cache. It's 1 and a green. It enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And at sorcery speed, you can tap it to move a counter from it to another creature. And then also, whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, this gets a +1/+1 counter. So this artifact ends up being worth more than +2/+2 over time, because you get some of those back and then can keep moving them around. Yeah, so there are a bunch of things that put counters on stuff. And then obviously, as I've talked about a lot with equipment and stuff in previous episodes, a +1/+1 counter is kind of worth an amount that's proportional to the number of and or strength of keywords on that +1/+1 counter, or the thing that has the +1/+1 counter. Like a creature with flying getting bigger is a lot better than a creature without flying getting bigger. A creature with lifelink getting bigger is a lot better than a creature without lifelink getting bigger. A creature with both flying and lifelink getting bigger is very valuable. A creature with double strike getting bigger is about twice as good as a creature without double strike getting bigger. So this archetype, given that it has a lot of ways to put counters on things, is looking for keywords. Kinjali's Dawn Runner is a 3-mana 1/1 that explores when it enters the battlefield and has double strike. That would be a card that you're looking for to put counters on. In general, I don't think green-white has that many cards with good keywords. Colossadactyl is 2 green for a 4/5 reach trample. That's a relatively good one. It's another uncommon. So overall, I think my guess is that this is an archetype that was somewhat gutted in development and didn't quite get enough back. And so there's a lot of enablers for it and not a lot of payoffs. You do have creatures that are reasonably big. You have some creatures with keywords that you can put counters on. Miner's Guidewing, the 1/1 flying vigilance for 1, that when it dies, target creature explores, is another really good one to be putting counters on. Flying plus vigilance is great for making bigger. And then also Staggering Size, 1 and a green instant, target creature gets +3/+3 and trample. The last time this was printed, it was called Predator's Strike, and it was in original Mirrodin a long time ago. And I thought that it was one of the best cards at common in that set. That was about 20 years ago, and power creep has happened. So I don't know that Staggering Size would be as good as Predator Strike was, but it's a reasonable card to try to build an aggressive strategy around. Overall, I'm not super optimistic about the amount of synergy here, but it's something. Moving on to blue-black. The stated archetype here is Descend Control. So Descend cares about permanents being in or entering your graveyard. A blue-black control deck typically isn't going to be all that good at having permanents. You're going to want a lot of instants and sorceries. I think the same is true here. I think the deck does want a lot of instants and sorceries. I think you want removal, card draw, counter spells, and most of that is going to come from instants and sorceries. But there are some cards that make it easy to get stuff in the graveyard. Some things that mill or discard, and you'll have permanents in your deck. So I do think that you can enable your descend stuff, but you also do have to be mindful of your ratio of permanents to non-permanents, just enablers and payoffs in general when you're drafting this deck. So as far as stuff you're looking for here, there's some good removal. I don't need to go into the details about that. There's a 6-mana 4/4 flyer. If you have 4 permanents in your graveyard, when you play it, you get to bounce something. There's a 5-mana sorcery that returns a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then that creature explores twice. This is particularly noteworthy because there's a cycle of creatures with land cycling. The blue creature with land cycling has Ward 3, and it's a 6/7, and it has island cycling. So you can island cycle it to have a permanent in your graveyard for a descend. If you have things that care about having descended that turn, you can trigger those. And then you can get it into play for 5 mana and have it explore twice. And then, potentially have an 8/9 or maybe a 6/7 that drew some cards with Ward 3. So that's a reasonable kind of go-to plan for your Zombify. And then there's also a similar land cycler in every other color. Hoverstone Pilgrim. This is a card that I know a lot of people thought of me when they saw it. This is a 5-mana 2/5 flying creature with Ward 2, and you can spend 2 mana to put a creature from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library. I think Ward 2 makes this card quite a bit better than it would otherwise be. Flying is also important. And I do think 2 mana to put a card from a graveyard on the bottom of its owner's library is a really strong ability in this set, and especially in this archetype. There are a lot of ways to mill yourself, so I think that it's going to be reasonable to get to the point where you would run out of cards to play, or run out of cards in your deck if you didn't have this. And also, unlike the card that I've been playing in Shadows over Ixalan Remastered, or Shadows, not Ixalan, Shadows over Innistrad Remastered, Epitaph Golem, this can target your opponent's stuff, so you can turn off their descend, you can mess with their ability to craft. I think this card is actually going to be pretty important for this archetype. Often I play these cards, but they're kind of a meme. But I think this one's legitimately good and important for what's going on here. There are some other cards that let you explore, sometimes multiple times, sometimes once. Those are good ways to potentially get stuff in the graveyard for your descend count. There's a 4-mana 3/2 artifact creature that when it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a basic land or cave and put it onto the battlefield tapped. I think this is mostly going to be something that people drafting the cave deck, which we'll talk about later, are going to want, but I think it's pretty good in blue-black. You use a lot of mana, and it trades off pretty easily, and then it gets you a thing in the graveyard. At common, you have a 4-mana draw 3, discard 1 sorcery. You also have, that's just a good control card, and the discard 1 is often going to discard a land that's going to help with your descend stuff. Another chance is 2 and a black, mill 2, then you can return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. The mill is optional. I think this card's very good. Buried Treasure is a really interesting card. It's a 2-mana treasure. Just a 2-mana artifact that can sack for a mana of any color. You can spend 5 mana and exile it from your graveyard to discover 5. So it's a card that you can put in your graveyard at any time, and then it's active from your graveyard. I think it's pretty clearly a lot better if you discard it or mill it than if you actually cast it and sacrifice it for a mana. But this is something that you really want to pair with Ancestral Reminiscence, the draw 3, discard 1, or anything else you can find that's going to let you have some kind of looting effect, or play if you have a lot of self-mill. The graveyard value is pretty nice, and it's just hanging out and powering up your descend before you discover with it. dead weight. It's going to be better here than in other places because it's a removal spell that's also permanent in your graveyard. And then there's some other like little enablers, like there's a 2-mana 1/1 Death Touch that mills 2 when it enters, and there's a 3-mana 3/2 that when it enters, you can look at the top 3 cards of your library, put up to 1 on top, back on top, and the rest in your graveyard. So you get some card selection plus some self mill on a creature that's also able to trade off pretty well. I think that's pretty good. So all in all, I think, the tools are here. There are reasonable counter spells, reasonable removal spells, reasonable enablers. You need to be pretty careful with how you're going to balance the various needs of a deck that needs, enablers and payoffs and permanents and non-permanents and stuff. But I think blue-black looks pretty fun. So moving on to blue-red, as I mentioned, the stated theme here is artifact aggro. There are also some pirate synergies. The signpost uncommon here is Captain Storm Cosmium Raider. It's blue-red for a 2/2, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on a pirate. I think this card's very good. I think that blue-red wants to play a lot of creatures that are artifacts or creatures that make an artifact when they enter. I think it's pretty reasonable to get it so this thing is making a +1/+1 counter when almost any of your creatures enter, and also sometimes when you do other stuff. There's a bounce spell that makes a map that triggers this at instant speed. There's a +2/+0 and first strike combat trick that makes a treasure and triggers this at instant speed. I think Captain Storm is really good. It also works with Careening Minecart, the vehicle that has the 3-mana vehicle with crew 1 that becomes a 3/3 that makes a treasure. The Diamond Pickaxe. So a lot of ways to make artifacts, often multiple artifacts. So I think that's going to work out pretty well. Enterprising Scallywag is another thing that's going to make multiple artifacts. This is a 2-mana 2/2, and at the end of your turn, if you descended, you make a treasure. Spyglass Siren is a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that makes a map when it enters. I think Staunch Crewmate is very good in this archetype. It's a 2-mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you can look at the top 4 cards of your library to choose an artifact or creature and put it into your hand. Yeah, and then some other relevant cards for this. Cogwork Wrestler. It's a 1-mana 1/2 flash artifact creature that when it enters gives something -2/-0. Also another instant way to trigger Captain Storm, but I think I have been impressed in the past with cards like this in blue-red aggressive decks. It's pretty easy to have red creatures that your opponent has to try to trade with, and then you can protect them with this thing while getting another artifact into play, another creature into play. It's just a good go wide tempo type play. Also the red 1-drop Goblin Tomb Raider. This is red for a 1/2, but if you have an artifact, it gets +1/+0 and haste. It's basically not going to be a 2/2 haste on turn 1, but anytime you draw it after that, it's almost always just going to be a 2/2 haste for 1, which is great. I think blue-red looks very good and very aggressive overall. Brazen Blade Master is a 3-mana 2/3. When it attacks, it gets +2/+1 if you control 2 or more artifacts. I think it's going to be very easy to have 2 or more artifacts, given all the stuff that's making maps and treasures, in addition to equipment and vehicles and artifact creatures. So a 3-mana 4/4 on offense at common is going to play very well in this kind of strategy. You also have a 2-mana 3/3 in Shipwreck Sentry, which is 1 in blue for a 3/3 defender that can attack if an artifact entered. That one's a little bit awkward just because it forces you to play your spells before combat, so it doesn't play well with combat tricks. But 3/3 for 2 in blue-red is pretty great. Yeah, I think blue-red is... We're very much not doing the spells thing, which is nice. We've done a lot of the spells thing, and this feels very blue-red, but in a very different way. This is very blue-red aggro. I do think that the tricks and bounce spells and artifact synergies and stuff are going to give it a pretty blue feeling, while it's going to do the fun tempo aggro thing. So yeah, I'm optimistic about blue-red. Up next, blue-green. The stated theme for blue-green is explore midrange. It's kind of merfolky in that the merfolk often, there are a lot of merfolk that explore. The key cards for this are basically just a bunch of cards that explore. Because exploring lets you put cards in the graveyard, I think that this uses the blue and green descend cards pretty well. So we just talked about blue black, which has like, heavy descend theme. Blue green has a heavy explore theme. Green black is also a heavy descend theme. So I talked about how Jeskai is doing artifacts. Sultai is really doing graveyard and doing like descend and explore, and it's all kind of the same thing. And I think that because green's in the mix and blue's in the mix, and that these decks all want to be pretty controlling, I see myself playing Sultai specifically pretty often. I'm less sure that I'm going to be playing Jeskai often. I might end up finding a Jeskai control deck that I like, but Jeskai is a little too aggressive for me to like think I'm going to be really excited about it. Although the existence of treasure and the existence of colorless fixing cards that are artifacts that my artifact deck is interested in anyway means that I wouldn't be terribly surprised if I find myself being like Jeskai artifacts more often than I might have thought a second ago. So yeah, I think like Jeskai and Sultai are two of the major like 3-color decks. I think a lot of the other 3-color decks don't really make sense, but I think those two really, really do. I think a lot of the green cards that you're going to be blue and green cards you're going to be looking for in blue green are going to be things that explore, other things that mill you, and then stuff that cares about your graveyard. Incidentally, the signpost uncommon here is the cancel or something like that. Current conductor, blue-green 2/3 for 2. When you explore a land, put it onto the battlefield tapped. When you explore a non-land, this gets a +1/+1 counter. Very good if you're doing a lot of exploring. There's another kind of signpost uncommon explore enabler, which is twists and turns. The green enchantment, if a creature would explore, scry 1, then explore. And when this ETBs, a creature explores, and then you have 7 lands, this turns into like a land that taps for a green, or you can spend 3 mana and tap it to look at your top 4 for a creature and put it into play. So it's like a search for a Scanta, but for creatures. I think that's going to be good if you have like a lot of explore. Not very good otherwise, but pretty good with the the blue-green explore uncommon payoff thing. Yeah, I'm not going to get too much into listing all of the random commons that apply here. You have Poison Dart Frog, the mana creature. It's a 1 and a green for a 1/1 Death Touch. A 1/1 Reach. You can tap it for mana of any color, and you can spend 2 mana to give it Death Touch until end of turn. So you got some ramp, you got like the land cyclers, you get a bunch of explore, you get some descend payoffs. Your mid-range, because you kind of want to play these land cyclers to enable your descend stuff, and so that you have something to do with all the extra lands you end up getting from exploring. And then you can play the mana creature, and so then you just kind of like explore to like get some value to play big stuff in the late game, and your big stuff is better if you descend. I think that's basically what's going on in blue-green, but again, I think it's also often going to want to get some black in there. Black-red's stated theme, moving on to the next archetype, is descend aggro. The idea is you're supposed to be in kind of the like reckless aggro where you like attack with a bunch of stuff and some of it dies and it triggers your other things, so you don't really care that it died. I think the support for this looks terrible. There are a bunch of things that I think are basically bad versions of the white creature that you can tap 2 things to put a +1/+1 counter on. You have 4 mana 3/4 and 4 mana 3/3 that at the end of your turn, if you descended, the 3/3 gets a +1/+1 counter, and the 4/3 makes a 1/1 fungus that can't block. These things like slowly and conditionally grow. There's a 3 mana 2/2 menace that grows if you descended. I think all of these are just like a really bad rate. Like they'd be okay, but still kind of underwhelming if you were guaranteed to trigger them. And I think in reality, you're going to fail to trigger them somewhat often. I don't really get why any of the like printed synergies here would actually work. So like black red might be fine, but it's going to be super low synergy. Is my read of the cards that look like they're supposed to go in it. I do think that the black red signpost uncommon is just a strong card. Zayoa Lava Tongue is a black red 2/2 death touch. At the end of your turn, if you descended, your opponent either discards a card, sacrifices a permanent, or takes 3. I don't think it's anything special, but it's pretty solid. I think it's worse than like the other 2-mana gold cards, and I think that its synergies are less supported. So I don't know. Basically, I'm really low on black-red, at least from a synergy perspective. Up next, red-green. Red-green's Dinosaurs. There's an uncommon mana creature for 1 mana that can tap for a mana to cast Dinosaurs. Unfortunately, there are only 7 common Dinosaurs. 2 of them are the expensive land cycling creatures. 2 of them are 4 mana 4/3s. The green one explores. The red one is an artifact that gives a creature menace when it enters. I think the green one's a lot better than the red one. There's a 6 mana 7/7 ETB Scry 2. You can spend 4 mana to make it unblockable by creatures with power 2 or less. That card seems pretty solid. There's a 5 mana 4/5 Reach that taps deal 2. Playable but very unexciting. And then there's a 3 mana 3/3 that if you have a dinosaur gains 3 life. I'm not very impressed by the common dinosaur offerings. They are fine, but really don't make a deck. The uncommon dinosaurs are quite a bit better. There is a 2 mana 3/2 Trample, which is pretty good to begin with. It's just 1 in a red for a 3/2 Trample. But also, whenever another dinosaur enters the battlefield, this copies its base power and toughness until end of turn. And your other dinosaurs are often pretty big. So that one's pretty good. And then its Quinth, Firstborn of Gishath, is the red-green signpost card. It's a 2/3 haste for 2. And then when it enters, you can spend 2 mana. And if you do, a dinosaur you control deals damage equal to its power to another creature. So you can play this as a 4 mana 2/3 deal 2, like a twin shot sniper that also has haste. But if you have like another bigger creature, then it deals more damage than that. And also you can just play it as a 2/3 haste on turn 2. So I think that card's really good. So both of the 2 mana uncommon dinosaurs are really good. And then at 3 mana, you have Thrashing Brontodon, the reprinted 3/4 that you can spend 1 mana and sack it to disenchant. And then Scytheclaw Raptor, which is a 4/3 for 3. Whenever a player plays a spell during another player's turn, they take 4 damage. Both of those are pretty good. So, like, Dinosaurs seems really good, but given that there are no 2 mana dinosaurs at common and 1 kind of weaker 3 mana dinosaur at common, I feel like there will be some good dinosaur decks, but you can't really like plan to draft it based on commons. You need to just like ideally get past some uncommons, get the sense that most of the rest of the table is not in, and then move into it. It's a very uncommon based archetype is kind of what I'm getting at here. So then the other archetype, the secret 11th archetype, is Caves. Caves structurally looks very similar to Gates in that there's like 1 really strong uncommon payoff in each color. There are technically 2 green uncommons that care about Caves. And then also some like decent support at commons, or at common. I'm pretty into Caves. I think most decks aren't very excited about drafting Caves, and I think the uncommons look pretty strong to me. And I think that the fixing seems pretty available and not very contested. I think that despite the fact that like Caves are much weaker than Gates for letting you play a 5-color deck, there's like a cave that makes your other caves tap for any color of mana. And there are a bunch of things that let you search for a cave. So like if you have that, then you can just like get like the campus guide type guy, the common 2/1 that searches for a cave, and then also the 4 mana 3/2 that searches for a cave and puts it into play. to like fix your mana like instantly and perfectly. And then even if you don't have that, you can still potentially find the right caves and stuff like that. And then you can just play like a multicolor deck where people aren't fighting you on fixing much in a set that has a lot of treasures. And I think the payoffs that exist are pretty good. So what are the signposts for the cave archetype? It's just all the uncommons that say cave on them. So in white, you have Bat Colony, which is a 3-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you make a bat for each mana spent from a cave to cast it. And whenever a cave enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. This is super good if you're getting 3 tokens out of it. Pretty good if you're getting 2. Not very good if you're getting fewer than that. Calamitous Cave-In is the red one. It's a 4-mana sorcery that deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker, where X is the number of caves you control plus the number of caves in your graveyard. So this is very, very similar to the Gate payoff. The Gate payoff only cost 3 mana. The black one is an 8-mana 5/5 lifelink that costs 1 less for each cave you control and each cave in your graveyard. There's an uncommon 3-mana artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you can look at the top 6 cards of your library and put a land from among them onto the battlefield tapped. And then you can craft it with a cave for 6 mana to make a 5/5. And then there's Splunking, which is a 3-mana enchantment, also green. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Then you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. If you put a cave onto the battlefield, you gain 4 life, and then lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So this is like explore for 1 extra mana that gains 4 life if you're like a dedicated cave deck, and then also means that all your caves are no longer tap lands, which is pretty big. The blue one, Sinuous Benthesaur, is a 6-mana 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of caves you control plus caves in your graveyard. Put 2 of those cards into your hand and the rest of them on the bottom of your library in a random order. So ETB draw 2 on a 4/4 for 6, where you actually get selection, is quite good. And then the colorless uncommon cave enabler is the 4-mana 3/2 that when it enters, you can search your library for a basic land or cave and put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So I think that package looks pretty good. And then you also just get the various things that the actual caves are doing for you. And then, the other kind of, I talked about how I think like Jeskai and Sultai make sense. Esper might make some sense. It's not very high synergy, but I think it combines a bunch of decks that are reasonably looking to be controlling. Mardu isn't super high synergy, but there might be some kind of like go wide sack angle. And then none of the other 3-color pairs really make particular sense to me. Obviously, there's going to be reasons to be like any 2 colors splashing any 3rd color just based on specific cards you see. Like if you just open a powerful card when you were drafting a deck that was some other colors. But as far as decks that have like meaningful overlap in synergies between their things, that's what I think is going on. I know that black-green is doing the like self-mill descend thing. Its signpost uncommon is a 3-mana 3/3 that gets +2/+2 and trample if you have descend 4, and gets plus 2/2 more and can't be blocked by multiple creatures, I think, if you have descend 8. There's, you're looking for explore and descend and self-mill stuff to turn that on. And then there are a bunch of descend payoffs. I think it's a pretty straightforward, slower archetype, but with the ability to turn the corner quickly. Like it has a bunch of big stuff and good grinding power. So that's what I put together. So I'm gonna turn it over to chat for additional questions and discussion. As always, if you are interested in supporting the show, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes for all of the offerings. Also, the detailed lists here of all the cards that I was looking at for these archetypes and what they do are here, are available in the notes to patrons at the 2nd tier or above. What are the archetypes I consider strongest first impression. Blue-red looks pretty good. Blue-white might be good, I'm not sure. I think Sultai makes sense, and I think white-black actually seems pretty good to me. And I'm definitely interested in caves. How easy do I think it would be to get good fixing for splashing? So I think that it depends on what you consider good fixing, but I think that the fixing that exists isn't going to be very contested. So if you're willing to play some 2/1s that search for a cave, then like a cave or basic, then like I think you can get those pretty freely. The fixing is definitely weaker than it is in Wild's Veldrain, but I think it's possible to make it work. But we'll see how much weaker. This is definitely going to be mostly a 2-color set, very, very much unlike Wild's Veldrain. How do you think a Braid is going to play? Like ultra premium removal or just pretty good? Ultra premium removal. It's going to, I mean, it kills, like there are so many artifacts and then it also kills most creatures. I think it's going to be like a little bit medium against green decks, I guess, but fantastic other than that. Do you think cards that say Descend 8 are feasible for decks other than dedicated self-mill? No. I think that like you should not plan on Descend 8 happening if you're not like really working for it. Like you might end up playing some weirdly grindy control mirror or something, but it'll happen in a very, very, very small portion of your game if you're not actively putting cards in your graveyard in some way. Is this a 16 land format? Hard no. Like caves let you use extra lands for spell-like effect. There are also a bunch of mana sinks in the crafting. There's not a ton of fixing. There are a bunch of mana sinks. I mean, you know, there might end up being some like dedicated 2-color aggro decks that end up shaving a land, but I think I would rather just put an extra cave in my deck or whatever. How much do you value map tokens? Roughly a blood or considerably worse? I think more or less blood power level. Which equipment cards do I think are best? This is not something I've researched, but I can think about it quick. I don't know if we count Idol of the Deep King as an equipment card. That's the 3-mana flash artifact that deals 2 damage to any target when it enters, and then you can craft it into an equipment. And then similarly, Sunfire Torch is red equipment that's red to play, and equipped creature gets +1/+0. And when it attacks, you can sacrifice the torch to do 2 damage to any target, which is like barely an equipment, mostly like a shock that sometimes pumps your guys. I think both of those are solid. Malamet Scythe is also like kind of barely an equipment, like it's mostly a flash aura. That's the 3-mana 2/2 flash or 3-mana flash equipment that attaches itself when it enters, and equipped creature gets +2/+2, but then you can equip it for 4. I think that card's like decent, but also not super equipment-y. I think in general, equipment in this set looks a bit better than it has been lately. I think like Pirate Hat's pretty interesting. That's 2 mana for an equipment that has Equip Pirate 1 and otherwise Equip 2. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has, when this attacks, draw a card, then discard a card. This is a good set for draw and discard, and there are like a lot of flyers that you can put this on. And then I think among the uncommon equipment, Diamond Pickaxe is probably the best. That's the red indestructible equipped creature has +1/+1, and when it attacks, make a treasure. That's 2 to equip. All right. I think that's going to wrap up this preview. We'll have a lot more information after playing with the set tomorrow and over the next week. So this covers my ability to speculate at this point, and we'll see how much changes when I talk to you next week. So have a good week. Enjoy early access, those of you who are playing or watching, or, well, a lot of you, that's already passed. Pre-release and all that. Enjoy the pre-release this weekend, I suppose. And I look forward to learning how this actually plays rather than how it kind of looks like it might play. Have a good week, and I'll see you next week.
Prepare for light speed.